Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zor. Deuteronomy 34, 1-3. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the last episode and all the prior ones you've listened to. It's been a busy couple of weeks. December's seen a huge number of downloads, and I'm very pleased, and I'm actually recording this very early this Sunday. It's well before noon, believe it or not. And my goal for this week is to get a few more uploads scheduled for YouTube, kind of those backlogs of episodes. So if anyone is on YouTube and like to subscribe to the show, you can find me with the same name there. But for now, though, for this week, we're going to be talking about Asia and what they're going through at kind of our time frame for this season, the 8,000 to 6,000 BC mark. And we're just going to kind of continue on, as it were, kind of following similarly as we did in the 10,000 BC time frame. Now, before we get too far into that, though, I do need to kind of, do like a palate cleanser, as it were, before we get into this. Just kind of reset the stage, as it were. And we will be going back a little bit, at least for the start of this episode, and then kind of continuing on. And this first couple of episodes, we're probably going to be in the same general area for this region. Instead of starting in Arabia like we did after we got done with Africa at 10,000 BC, though, we're going to be focusing on the Middle East and the Levant more as a whole. We will, of course, talk about Arabia, but it's not quite as central because, humans have already migrated through there. It's not as big, or it's not as central of an area for human development as it was at the 10,000 BC, because that's kind of where humans probably initially left Africa from to get to India and then Australia and, of course, the rest of Asia. But we will get there. That's probably going to be our next section after we finish kind of the Levant, the Middle East. And that kind of brings me to one of the first big things I wanted to talk about. That is terminology. When we were here at the 10,000 BC mark, I went into the terminology of Mesopotamia and the origin for the names of the Tigris and Euphrates River, how we got those, and how, of course, we would define that region, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, for the podcast purposes. Now I want to go into detail about the term Levant and what I mean when I use that term. I'm kind of doing this piecemeal to fill some time, for certain episodes. And because we advance through history, new terms arise to describe regions that have been defined slightly differently than they were earlier. Some are culturally descriptive, some are geographic, and then there are some that are both. So I will be using Levant as a purely geographical term, at least for now. And I'm going to try and redefine this in the future if I plan on changing that. But for now, though, just going to define what I mean when I say Levant and how that term came to be and how it has been used. So the term in English was first used in the late 1400s AD and was derived from the French term Levante. And I apologize to my French listeners, what few that there are, for that pronunciation. Please forgive me. Now, this meant rising, which probably referred to the place where the sun rose. It is believed to have come into French from Italian, where the term could be used as a synonym for both east and for rising. They, of course, have other words for each of those terms, but that term means both. And as far as I know, there's no other term that overlaps. They have another term for east, and they have another term for rising, but no other term means both at the same time. So if that is the case, it's possible that the Italian term came from a translation of the Arabic term al-Mashriq. And this can refer to the East in general, or it can be translated poetically as the place where the sun shines forth. In geographic terms, this was meant to refer to the eastern half of the Arabic world. They were referring to a much larger area than what Europeans were talking about when they used Levant. I will be using a definition that is more in line with the traditional European definition, though it is slightly different. Also, you may have heard the term Maghreb used to describe like North Africa and Northwest Africa. That is literally the western half of the Arabic world. So there's the Maghreb and the Mashriq. For the Arabs, it was more of course, Arabia itself, and then a lot of countries south of Anatolia and parts of Egypt, all along the Mediterranean coast, up until you get to the Zagros Mountains in Iran, which, of course, they are not Arabs. They are varieties of Persian or Persian-speaking groups and some others as well. But we'll get into all of that in the future. Now, though, we're going to kind of focus back on my definition. So, I'm defining the region as starting at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, at the very south. Then you would draw a straight line north to the Mediterranean. Everything on the eastern side of the peninsula is part of the Levant. And the small gulf on the Sinai's eastern half is the Gulf of Aqaba. Everything on the western banks of that are in the Levant as well. Then there is a kind of a depression or dried out massive old river valley that still divides the region from the nearby deserts and scrublands, the scrublands and hills of Arabia. The region continues north to the Dead Sea, and I am including everything west of the Jordan Rift Valley up to the Dead Sea, where the Jordan River feeds into it. This is where the Levant then fans out from a narrow strip of land to a broader area. It continues up in the west, up the coast until the Anatolian Peninsula starts to jut out towards Greece. Somewhere around the modern city of, I think it's Dorital in southern Turkey. So in the east, it would, we're talking about it would spread to the north and east of where the Jordan River and Dead Sea meet along what is now the line of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq's borders, all the way to the western banks of the Euphrates River, and then as far north as the Syrian-Turkey border. Basically to the south of the Taurus and Caucasus Mountains, essentially what is the eastern half or eastern, maybe a third of the Fertile Crescent, depending on how you describe that region. And the western half of the Fertile Crescent, of course, being Mesopotamia. So I hope you can kind of follow along with that. I hope I've made that clear. I'm just kind of trying to give as succinct description as possible. So that's what I mean when I refer to the Levant, and then, of course, Mesopotamia, which we'll, of course, get into a little bit later. But for now, though, we should probably start to focus on the people that are living in the region we've just discussed. Apologies for that brief edit there. I had a lot more notifications come in, and then a siren came through. I think I got most of the notifications out, but I know there are still a couple you're going to hear. But I do apologize. So, we talked about the Natufian culture the last time we focused on this region. And of course, in last week's episode about them and their probable relations to both the Harafian and the Fayum A cultures. Now, by the start of the time frame we're in now, 8000 BC, the Natufian culture is considered to have disappeared around 1500 years or so prior. They, of course, didn't die out. Well, I mean, obviously they did die, but the peoples who had been part of the Natufian tradition or their descendants didn't disappear, and they weren't wiped out. But the similarities and continuity of artifacts and tools at the sites they occupied changed or even disappeared in some cases. There are sites that are abandoned as well that had been being used regularly. And there are new sites, of course, that are starting to be used. We'll be talking about the groups that split and developed from this culture, why they possibly did so, and kind of what was unique about them. I should also identify where the Natufians were found so we can compare that with their successor groups. Their sites and artifacts have been found as far to the south and west as the Sinai Peninsula, though not far inland, mostly along kind of the coast. They occupied and roamed modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and the western parts of Jordan that kind of border the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. They also seem to occupy a belt of territory that curved to the northeast into modern-day Syria up to the Euphrates River. And it seems they stayed between where the river turned from following almost directly south from Turkey to the big southeast bend before it turns almost completely to the east. So it created a very large curve or bend. So somewhere between about 40 to 50 kilometers, which is between 25 and 32 miles. Along the river that they're occupying. And they had sites on both sides of the river at this range. Today, unfortunately, there is a lake over parts of this area on the Euphrates, which that made it harder for me to do the math on that. So that may be a little off. Also, there are Natufian sites that are unfortunately now covered by water. Also, the Natufian culture went through periods where they were more mobile, where they were a semi-sedentary society, and then finally a fully sedentary society, although that period is very short in comparison to their whole history. And that brings up kind of the next thing I want to discuss about both the Natufians and their successor groups. The Natufian are a group that is most closely associated with the start of a period of time referred to as the Pre Pottery Neolithic. And this refers to kind of a transitory period of the New Stone Age, or the Neolithic, and that existed as various groups began to develop their technology in the run-up to the creation or adoption of ceramic pottery. This term could be applied to a few different places, though there are others that it wouldn't apply to. Places like in China, where they've had pottery for quite some time, up until now. Although, again, that's not all of China, that's only certain groups in China. That said, it is usually used to describe the Middle East and the Levant as a whole, and this makes sense as the term was invented by people studying the prehistory of this specific area. Think about how the Three Ages system of stone, bronze, and iron works well in Europe is because it was designed based on European sites. As, of course, you move to different areas, that's not necessarily the best term to talk about human adaptation and advancement as a society or culture. Now, this time frame is further split into subperiods, and those periods are further divided into generally early, middle, late, etc. The primary time frames we're going to refer to are the Pre Pottery Neolithic A, the Pre Pottery Neolithic B, and there are even those that also use Pre Pottery Neolithic C. This is a little bit rare to run across because I think it's kind of like it's very limited in terms of its geographic scope. But we may run into it. I may have to use it at a couple of points later. But for now, though, this is mostly going to be focused on PP&A and PP&B sites. Now, the start of the PP&A lines up with the last 500 years or so of Natufian culture. Though it is important to remember that the Natufian are, while they're the most famous of the groups of the PP&A period, they're not the only ones. And not all PP&A sites are Natufian. And I suppose that means it's possible that some Natufian sites may have been abandoned before this time frame. But I didn't really check the time frame on all of their sites to confirm that. So I guess it makes sense that since that is the end of their cohesive period, that would probably be the case. Now, who succeeded the Natufians is, again, a matter of contention. There are those that try to tie the PP&A as its own cultural tradition, and there can be no doubt of some ties between the Natufians, the PP&A, and other groups outside of the region that the Natufians, lived in. But there is a doubt as to whether those ties are genetic, linguistic, religious, material, or some amalgamation of all of those. And after the Natufians disappear, there are smaller regional subcultures under the PP&A umbrella tied to a smaller number of sites, though the sites themselves may be more notable than even Natufian ones are. And then there are cultures whose existence is tied to specific arrowheads or a specific type of tool made a certain way out of certain materials. All of these are controversial to some extent because there are claims that some cultures are an offshoot or derivation from one of the others, or vice versa. One example of this is the Sultanina culture and the Khiamean culture. There was a paper I read from the 1990s by Danny Nadal that argues that the entirety of the Khiamean tool set and lack of specifically datable material meant that the entirety of Khiamean artifacts were just an example of late I'm sorry, was just an example of Sultanina groups exhibiting inner site variations or experimentations. Though, from my understanding of that, is that the Kiamian arrowheads were spread far wider than the rest of the Sultaninian toolkits. Now, I am not an archaeologist, and I am not skilled enough to look at stone tools and be able to tell their material, who made them, or when. So I'm not going to be able to offer much in the way of an opinion on that. So I'm just going to try to lay out a few possibilities and as much evidence as I can. And this is going to remain true for a couple of episodes specifically. And I'll, of course, bring that up again if I need to. But just keep in mind that all of this is very much based on some level of conjecture. Now, again, all of the Pre Pottery Neolithic sites in the Levant are believed to be related to the Natufians and are considered to be their successors or successors to their successors or grand successors, however you want to talk about that. And that is, they're related either by, of course, location, toolkit, genetics, linguistics, etc. These groups continued the experiments that the Natufians had begun of living a more stationary, sedentary lifestyle, and continued to make it more and more feasible while still being hunter-gatherers. Now, you may ask, and it was a question for a while, as more and more evidence came out that sedentary or semi-sedentarism preceded agriculture. In some of our prior episodes, I've talked about how our ancestors are living in areas near several different kinds of environments and biomes. This is known as an ectone. In the southern Levant, for example, you have coastal plains, you have forests of cedars and other types of pine. The famous cedars of Lebanon, of course, being part of that. In the you have small, fertile river valleys and even mountains and hilly scrublands. So this gives them access to a number of wild plants, grasses, grains, legumes, and, beans, and even some wild fruit like figs. Now, of course, the major source of meat is still herds, but instead of following these animals like like our earliest ancestors did, and those further in the north and the steppes, they have begun to prey on herds that move in and out of locations seasonally. Now, semi-sedentary hunter and gatherer lifestyle could have been and probably was practiced to a small extent earlier than we expect. But the younger Dryas interrupted any groups attempting this type of lifestyle, and it caused, of course, a drop in vegetation and things like that. So they probably had to be a little bit more mobile. But once it was over, however, it seems that the area became conducive to more permanent habitation again. So as long as the environment could provide for their population until the herds arrived, they were able to stay in, more or less the same general area. They would, of course, hunt small local game as well as fish, in the areas year-round. They wouldn't just prey on the herds, but most bones found, I think, in this time frame are usually from types of wild antelope. And, of course, as time went on, you begin to see domesticated strains of plants they were eating and small herds of semi-domesticated sheep, cows, or aurochs in this case. And, then later you'll begin to see, what are probably more domesticated animals. It's hard to tell just from bones if in this early period if an animal was domesticated or, if it was a wild variety. But, as time goes on, around starting around the 7000s BC, you'll probably begin to see pigs gradually become introduced into that domestic sphere, which I'll be going into again when we talk about our next domestication episode, when we go over what has been added or will be added, during this time frame. I'll go into more detail on pigs. But gradually, all these semi-domesticated strains of crops and animals are going to become more vital rather than supplemental to our diet, which is what they were at the start, even at the 8000 BC start of our timeline. And it is at this time that we have numerous sites that have emerged and become sorts of mixes, kind of between, tiny towns or maybe base camps or watering holes or depots for several regional cultures. Now, I'm going to go over the major ones that have had the most research done on them. There are others, of course, and once more places start seeing intensive study and excavation, it's going to shift and refine our timeline more, and maybe even change what areas are considered more important. But for now, though, this is what we have. So I'm going to start in the south of the Levant. We have a site near the modern city of Jericho. Today, this is a Palestinian city on the West Bank. In Arabic, the name is Ariha, and the Hebrew name is Jericho. Now, all of the sources I could find point to the name being Canaanite in origin, though what the Canaanite meaning is or was for this name is debated. Most say it is related to the word rea or real, which means fragrant. Then there are those who say that the name comes from their word for moon, Yarea. The city was home to a temple to a lunar god known as Yarik. The reason most people think that fragrant is older is due to the fact that the site had been occupied far longer than the god has been attested in the area, and the moon wouldn't be localized in the same way the surrounding wild plants and palms, and there's a famous spring in the area, which we'll get into later, and there's numerous wild springs, which of course results in a lot of fragrant foliage, hence why they think Rhea is the more probable origin term. Now, you may notice that the Arabic and Hebrew names mean the same thing, and as you can tell by the similarity to their pronunciation, Canaanite is also a Semitic language, which is, of course, part of the Afro-Asiatic family. And we'll dive more into that subject, of course, later. But to get back to the actual type site of Jericho, which, again, that's the modern name for it. We don't know what the people living here at that time would be calling it. Could it have meant fragrant in an earlier language that the Canaanites themselves translated or maybe descended from? Who can say? I think probably not, just due to reasons we'll get in here a little bit shortly. Now, Jericho was occupied at some level or another as early as 10,000 BC, probably for longer, but because of the nearby natural spring and water sources, it was very popular among the Natufian, who made it a regularly used base camp kind of location. Now, at the end of the Younger Dryas, however, which is around 9600, 9500 BC, we see more and more evidence of continuous settlement and use of this site. The groups using this site are referred to as either Pre Pottery Neolithic, of course, which we talked about, and how it's kind of an umbrella term, but there's another couple of terms, one being the Kiameans and the other as the Sultanian. Again, this is a matter of some debate. Some say the Kiameans and the Sultanian are, just different versions of the same group. That the Kiameans are just a Sultanian. Excuse me. There are a couple of different ways to spell this. I'll go into that later. That the Kiameans are just a Sultanian group that uses a slightly modified tool set. Some say it's the other way around. There are those that argue that the Kiameans are the descendants of the Natufian, who stuck to a more traditional mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And the various regional Levantine sedentary groups are kind of their cousins who continue to experiment with the sedentary type of lifestyle. There's another thought that the regional groups are actually descendants of the Kiameans, who, because of weather changes, saw that sedentary life might be more viable or more comfortable. And still others argue that the Kiameans kind of were their own group, that they were merely neighbors of the Natufian and then their descendants and all that, and that comes with all that would entail. So fighting, trading, intermarriage, etc. The Natufians do have artifacts from, or material from far away, things like obsidian or volcanic rock. So they were trading. They were involved with trade. Perhaps the Kiameans or their predecessors were involved with that, if they are unrelated. So, but of course, again, that would come, if they were traders, that would, of course, come with all that would entail: fighting, intermarriage, whatever. Now, the name Kiamean comes from a place called El Kayam. This is located near the banks of the Dead Sea, not very far from Jericho. I wasn't able to get a firm answer as to where their oldest site is thought to have been. Though, again, their artifacts are found in some places that do not overlap with the Natufian. They were never quite as far south into the Sinai, certainly not to Egypt or Arabia, but they were found all the way to sites on both sides of the Tigris River in the east. So they were further east than the Natufians has been found. But whatever the exact case of the Kiameans, by 8000 BC, they have been gone for around 600 years at the latest. And the number of their artifacts seem to have been dwindling for longer than that. And one of their most distinctive artifacts is they made very interesting looking arrowheads out of chert. So they have been kind of going away. It's possible that they were indeed a late offshoot of the Natufians, and that they were getting swept up in this kind of sedentarism that was sweeping kind of the area. The other group that is connected to Jericho and is kind of firmly tied to the site's early sedentary period and the Pre Pottery Neolithic A period are the Sultanian. That name comes from Tell Sultan, which is the Arabic name for the tell that this ancient site was buried under. It translates as the hill of the Sultan. Now, tell is also an archaeological term which refers to kind of artificial hills or mounds that are left by successive long-term human usage of a location. They build up homes and encampments with things like dirt or mud brick, and then as those collapse or fall into disrepair, they're eventually knocked down or replaced. So slowly over time, the material used to construct homes is eventually used to build up these mounds, which are then later cleared away, leveled, and then reused. You'll see a lot of these in the Middle East and Turkey, mainly because, again, they have been occupied for slightly longer periods of time, but there are other structures they're virtually identical to Tell's, all over the world. Of course, some are bigger than others depending on where they were located and the types of material being used, but we'll go into more sites like that in the future. In all those places, not just here. Now, the Sultanian group is kind of associated with the southern Jordan Valley, with Jericho being considered their type site. Now, again, they could be just part of a wider PPNA, and this is just like a variance, but at 8000 BC, several things had already happened at Jericho that may better be associated with the Natufian, or whoever, maybe like a transitory group between periods, I guess, as they're evolving from one group to the next. But there is evidence, starting, probably somewhere between 9500 to 9000 BCE. Jericho already had small, kind of circular dwellings made of like mud brick, and this would include things like straw, kind of padded in to kind of make it thicker, and then of course being dried with sun, so it would be clay, straw, kind of mashed together, and then these bricks would kind of be plastered together with kind of a mud mortar. The houses are generally, around the same size. I don't think there's anything bigger than, 20 feet. And, they probably have very simple roofs made out of things like, sticks or, small twigs, just kind of mud mortared together, similar to the bricks. There is burial of the dead by these early groups. In fact, this is something I didn't bring up with the Fayum and the culture, mainly because they emerge again as our time frame is ending. But this is something you see in a lot of places in the Middle East. That is the burial of dead family members under the floor of the homes they're living in. There's a number of reasons for why they think this was done. Some say it's kind of like a claim on, this house, it's yours. We've got my, so such and such generations of grandparents, right here in the floorboards. This proves this house is mine. It could have been like a kind of, maybe they were protecting the home from spirits. They didn't want them to kind of be upset with them after they died, just kind of keeping them close. There's a number of things that this could have been used for. And this is something that you'll kind of see change gradually over time. Eventually there are separate burial areas, but a lot of early Neolithic cultures, at least in Egypt and the Middle East, you see a lot of keeping parts of your dead relatives with you for who knows whatever reasons. I love both my parents, but I don't know if I'd want their skulls like underneath my floorboards, and I don't know if they'd like that either, to be quite honest. I don't think they would. And of course, again, we've already talked about how they're relying on hunting mostly antelope with very little, not little, but a much less reliant on semi-domestic animals and plants. By the start of our timeline, though, at 8000 BC, there's been a lot of growth in and around Jericho. In fact, during the 50s, when this site was being excavated by Kathleen Kenyon, she did a 6-year study of the area that was kind of like a follow-up on an earlier studies, I believe in the early 30s. She was kind of excavating a site using some newer techniques like stratification, things like that, to kind of help date the site, because the stuff in the 30s, it had kind of connected the site and the walls with the story of Jericho in the Bible, that I partly quoted from at the start of this episode. She was able to push back the dating on this site much further. She was also able to find another structure that we're going to talk about. But essentially, what she was finding is that Jericho, at the time, was the earliest, I guess you might call, city found. And this, of course, it was older by almost 5,000 years than what the previously thought oldest city was. Now, we can get into a debate about what a city is and, what it constitutes, that kind of thing. And that was, of course, a debate held by people kind of reviewing and responding to her work at the time. But while I wouldn't necessarily myself call it a city, it is certainly far more advanced than anything we had suspected up to that point. It may not be a city, but it is well on its way to becoming one, at least at the time frame she is proposing, that she laid out. And it is, whether it's a city or not, it is the first walled city or first walled settlement that we have a record of. And these walls were very large, especially considering, these people did not have pottery or writing or draft animals, things like that. Like this is something unique at history, at least at this point, or at least it was something that was brand new, something that was never attempted at this scale, I'm sure, before. There may, of course, have been wooden walls at earlier times that, of course, we don't have records of, can't find anymore, but these stone fortifications, if that's what they were, it's possible they weren't used for defense. It's possible they could have been more monumental, or it could have been used to keep people in. It was probably defensive, of course, to an extent. I don't think you would bother building these if you weren't expecting to need them. But again, that's maybe just me kind of projecting my own opinions on things into the past. In terms of size, they were around 2 meters thick, which is about 6.5 feet. And then they were, I think, 17 feet high, which is like 5.1 or 5.2 meters high. And of course, this isn't consistent. These weren't like perfectly mapped out, but that's what they are at their thickest and highest points. Which, again, I think, fortification is probably likely. So this makes it basically the oldest city wall discovered pretty much anywhere. Even though there have been sites that have, I think, been found recently that show that maybe Jericho might not be the oldest city. And it's certainly not the oldest settlement, which we'll get into again in the next couple of episodes. But there was a period of time for around 40 years or so, I think, that was kind of considered, that was considered the case. So just something to keep in mind for the future, and just kind of show you how things can change. Now there was also a ditch for that was surrounding the wall, and I think it was around, I think they've estimated it was about 27-30 feet. wide, which is about 8 meters, and then it was about 3 meters deep, or about 9 feet deep, and that was cut through bedrock. So the amount of labor needed to do that, it would have, and to cover the size of the town, which was about, which I think covered about, 2,000 feet, which is like 600 meters. Just the amount of labor would have been tremendous. So that has led people to kind of conjecture like how many people lived in Jericho. It would have, it may not have been more than a couple of thousand, but to get that many people to work together would have been incredible. And it's very possible that, it could have been done over a much longer period of time with fewer people. The last estimates I was able to read were from, I think it was February of last year. And that was just from a encyclopedia, which was just, converted over from earlier notes. I think the most recent, new, estimates I saw was 2004. And basically the numbers range from, there were anywhere between, 200 to no more than 3,000 at most. And that's, of course, at peak population. There's always the chance that, that people weren't living there full time. It's very possible that this could have been like a kind of a ritual, like some of the families out hunting and gathering, some of the families nearby tending the crops, and then, they might congregate seasonally, kind of like how hunter-gatherers did. But whatever the case, even if it's towards the lower end of 200 people, that would probably be permanent. And hunter-gatherer groups, again, they're small family bands. You're not looking at more than 20, and that is most of the time. Again, they would swell probably to slightly larger bands in the winter, of course, when they did their whole, trade family members and, intermarriage and, band together to hunt, when things are a little bit harder to get off the ground and the trees. So they would have access to much more labor, much more resources regularly than, hunter-gatherer bands. It could have taken a while. I think 8,000 BC is kind of like the midpoint. There's some speculation it could have been built, in the century or two prior to that. And it's continually in use until, about 7,300 or so BCE. And in addition to the walls, you also have the Tower of Jericho. And this is huge. It's like 9 meters tall, which is about 28 feet, give or take. It's slightly less than 9 meters. It might be 8.5. But this thing is, it itself is as big as those walls. Now, what the tower was used for is a little bit more based on conjecture. It, of course, was probably a great lookout spot, especially on top of the hill where Jericho was. But it could have also been used as a storehouse for grain, or other resources. It could have kind of served as an early version of a castle or a keep, maybe to house a specific person or family, to kind of keep watch, or to kind of maybe lead the city and then go from there. Now, the tower itself isn't, the walls on it aren't quite as thick as the walls of Jericho. I think the tower is no more than 5 feet thick, maybe even slightly less than that. Its base is about 30 feet. and then as it went up, it got narrower to around 23 feet at the top. So it is something that is it's still impressive, even if it's not quite as gargantuan in terms of depth as the walls were. It was definitely a strong addition. And this thing, kind of think of it as like a squat, like almost a fat tower, and it had steps kind of carved into the back to kind of let you in. So it was not, completely thick all the way through. I think they've estimated that it would. Excuse me, sneeze. So I cut myself off there. They estimated that it took about 11,000 days to complete for one human. So obviously, if they have a couple of hundred people, that does cut down. And if they obviously had more, that would make it substantially less. But that does show that they're devoting time and resources, that they have enough resources to have this additional time for people to not be hunting and gathering, which is, of course, all the work that a hunter and gatherer would ever do. That's all they would ever need to do, that and cleaning and, just normal day-to-day stuff, which, you may not even consider work. So they have some type of stockpiles that they are keeping to allow them to, undertake this task. Now, again, I went into what this could be. It's possible that this was a type of storage place or silo. It's also possible it could have some type of religious connotations. There are other societies that, if they're on towers, they, or at higher elevations, they think they're closer to the heavens, that kind of thing. And then not just in other regions. Like, that is something that happens in this region even in later times. And maybe not even later times. It may be happening in other sites that are contemporaneous with Jericho. And there is, of course, even now evidence that Jericho, there is now evidence that there were maybe other towers that even predated Jericho in the region. I think at Tell Sultan, which is a site in Syria, further to the north of here. Actually, I think it's near the city of modern-day Aleppo. There was excavations being done by a Polish-Syrian team, just trying to see what they could find in the area. I think they found the remains of quite an old settlement. I couldn't get the exact dates because that is a matter of some contention, but that it was predating Jericho, and that it may have been like a proto-city, much similar to Jericho, and that it had 5 towers that are very similar to what you would see, or what you would have found in Jericho. So they didn't have just the one tower, they had multiple, they had 5. And that, this place was older even than Jericho. That could mean that it was, it's possible that this was around and it was a Natufian site. And it could have been related to the culture that is going on in Göbekli Tepe and Catalhoyuk, and that maybe that Jericho is perhaps a colony of those groups further to the north, or that the information was disseminated along trade routes, because Jericho is definitely involved in trade. There are, again, you have signs of obsidian and volcanic rock that would not be found in the area. So there is some type of trade going on. So yes, there is evidence of an older site that has a kind of a similar tradition of building, early monolithic structures. So, you know, how closely related they are, if they're both Natufian descendants or the Natufians were interacting with the people at Tel Caramel, and then they disseminated that to their descendant groups. Again, we can't really say. And unfortunately, the site in Syria, due to the civil war breaking out, they had to cut it short. I think they only got, of like less than 50% of the site even like fully documented and excavated. So that civil war does not seem to be close to stopping. So unfortunately, we may never know what happened there. But to continue with Jericho, so yes, the walls, the tower are in use for a few hundred years until you get to about somewhere between 7,300 to 7,000 BCE. And Jericho is then abandoned for a period of time. Why it was abandoned is, of course, unknown. There are a number of theories. It has been suggested that perhaps there was an earthquake in the area. That would explain why a portion of the walls collapsed and the tower kind of eroded away, at least at the top. There is always the possibility that it was invaded. After all, why build walls if you don't need them? It's possible that they were kind of under attack from a group. And there is, of course, the possibility that there was some type of plague or illness that spread. Again, this is very early in the days of animal rearing. Perhaps that we have our first crossover of a virus and that it was spreading among the more tightly compact, even though Jericho is not, of course, a planned out city. It is still a relatively contained one. And I didn't mention it, but the houses, there is no central planning. This site does not seem to be grid-shaped. There is not any type of center structure that is necessarily taller. Of course, there is the tower, but most of the homes seem to be, within reasonable dimensions and relation to each other in terms of size. It's very much a organically grown city. It's not centrally planned. So yeah, perhaps there was a plague. Perhaps they were attacked by an outside group. Perhaps they were overgrowing their crops. Perhaps there was a bad case of soil erosion. But whatever the case, the site is abandoned for a couple of hundred years, at least in terms of large settlement. It's always possible that there could have been small groups that stay behind, maybe stragglers or squatters from an outside group, or just people who just didn't want to leave, and they were like, well, it's good enough. Eventually, though, it would be resettled, and there has been kind of a change or evolution in the culture, and this is now the period known as Pre Pottery Neolithic B. But we're going to go more into that, I think, in the next episode. I've been recording for almost an hour now, and it's been a very long episode. In fact, this will be the longest episode. I do need to try and get a little bit more of those notifications out, and I think there are some sirens that still need to be edited out as well. I can't guarantee I'll get rid of everything, but I'm certainly going to try. I'd like to thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or feedback, please let me know. I hope you've enjoyed. You can reach me, of course, at my email, waradrevpod@gmail.com. Or, of course, you can reach me at my Twitter link, which I will include in the description. So next week we'll be back. We'll be continuing with the Jericho during the Pre Pottery Neolithic B, and we'll, of course, continue on through the region after that. I don't think the next episode will be entirely based in Jericho, but we will have to see, I suppose. But yeah, please let me know if there's any questions, or if you catch anything that you might like to point out, please tell me. But yeah, I hope you enjoy, and I hope you continue listening. And I'd like to thank you for doing that on, on this weekly basis. But yeah, I hope you'll be back next time. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.